The morning my world crumbled started with a text message that made my coffee taste like ash in my mouth. "Mom, please don't come to the restaurant tonight. My friends from college are visiting, and honestly, you'll just make things awkward. You know how you look lately." I stared at the screen of my cracked phone, reading those words over and over until they burned themselves into my retinas like a brand. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. You know how you look lately, my own daughter, my flesh and blood. The child I had carried for 9 months, nursed through countless midnight fevers, sacrificed everything for, had just told me I was too ugly to be seen in public with her. I set the phone down with trembling hands and caught my reflection in the black screen. 52 years old, gray roots showing through what used to be honey blonde hair, crow's feet mapping the geography of too many sleepless nights, and clothes that hung loose on a frame that had forgotten how to eat properly since David left. When had I become this woman? When had I become someone my own daughter was ashamed to be seen with? My name is Margaret Walsh, though everyone used to call me Maggie back when I was someone worth knowing. Back when I had a husband who looked at me like I hung the moon, a successful catering business that was the talk of suburban Atlanta, and a daughter who actually wanted to spend time with me. That was before the divorce papers, before the business partnership dissolved into bitter lawsuits, before I found myself living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment in Marietta, while my ex-husband David moved his 28-year-old secretary into our dream house in Buckhead. The apartment smelled like the previous tenant's cat, despite the landlord's assurances that it had been professionally cleaned. The walls were beige, the carpet was beige, even my life had become beige. Everything interesting about me had been stripped away piece by piece over the past 18 months, leaving behind this hollow shell of a woman who apparently wasn't even fit to meet her daughter's college friends. Jessica was 26, beautiful in that effortless way that comes from good genes and better skincare, with David's sharp jawline and what used to be my bright green eyes. She worked for a nonprofit in downtown Atlanta, lived in a trendy loft in Virginia Highland, and had somehow managed to emerge from our family's spectacular implosion completely unscathed. At least on the surface. The text had come in response to my excited message about finally being able to afford dinner at Seasons 52, the upscale restaurant where she'd mentioned wanting to try the wood-fired salmon. I'd been saving for weeks, skipping meals and walking instead of driving to scrape together enough money for what I'd hoped would be a nice mother-daughter evening. A chance to reconnect. A chance to show her that even though my world had fallen apart, I was still her mother. I still mattered. Apparently, I was wrong. I walked to the bathroom mirror, the one with the unforgiving fluorescent light that made everyone look like they were dying of consumption. The woman staring back at me was indeed a far cry from the vibrant entrepreneur who used to command respect at Chamber of Commerce meetings. My skin had taken on a grayish pallor that no amount of drugstore foundation could hide. The stress of the divorce, the financial ruin, the complete upheaval of everything I'd built had carved deep lines around my eyes and mouth. My hair, once my pride and joy, hung limp and lifeless around my shoulders because I couldn't afford the salon visits that used to keep it glossy and full. But it wasn't just the physical changes that made me unrecognizable. It was something deeper. Something that had been slowly leaching out of me like color from fabric left too long in the sun. Confidence, maybe. Purpose. The sense that I mattered in the world. The divorce had been David's idea, though he'd been kind enough to let me think it was mutual for the first few conversations. We'd been married for 28 years, and I genuinely believed we were happy. Sure, we'd had our rough patches, especially when the catering business started consuming all my time and energy. There were missed dinners, forgotten anniversaries, conversations that happened in passing between the kitchen and the car. But I thought we were building something together. I thought he understood that the sacrifices were temporary, that once the business was established, once Jessica was through college, we'd have time for us again. I was still thinking that right up until the morning I found the credit card statements hidden in his office desk. Hotel charges, restaurant bills for two, jewelry purchases from stores I'd never been to. The evidence of a double life that had been running parallel to ours for over a year. When I confronted him, he didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. "Maggie, come on," he'd said, not even looking up from his laptop. You can't honestly say you're surprised. When was the last time we actually talked about something other than your business or Jessica's latest drama? When was the last time you looked at me the way you look at a perfectly plated entree? The accusation had hit like a slap. Yes, I'd been busy. Yes, I'd been distracted. But I'd been building something for us, for our future. The catering company, Magnolia Events, had gone from a hobby to a full-scale operation with 12 employees and a waiting list of clients. We were booked solid for 18 months out, featured in Atlanta magazine, recommended by the city's top wedding planners. I was proud of what we'd built. We? David had laughed when I said that. Maggie, this is your thing. It was always your thing. I never wanted to spend my weekends dealing with bridezillas and picky corporate clients. I wanted a wife, not a business partner. The business partnership he was referring to was the formal arrangement we'd set up when Magnolia Events started turning serious profit. David had insisted on being listed as co-owner for tax purposes, and I'd been grateful for his business acumen when it came to contracts and financial planning. He'd helped me navigate the complexities of growth, hiring, vendor relationships. Or so I'd thought. It turned out that having his name on the business documents made it significantly easier for him to systematically destroy everything I'd built during the divorce proceedings. He'd convinced our accountant to restructure our assets in ways that made the business appear less profitable than it actually was. He'd reached out to key vendors and subtly undermined my relationships with them, planting seeds of doubt about my ability to manage operations without his oversight. By the time I realized what was happening, 3 of my biggest clients had mysteriously decided to go with competitors, and 2 of my most experienced staff members had been poached by a rival company that David just happened to have connections with. The final blow came when he filed for dissolution of our business partnership, claiming irreconcilable differences in management style and vision. Because he was technically a 50% owner, he was entitled to half of everything, including client contracts, vendor relationships, and even the company name. The legal fees alone consumed what little liquid assets I had left. And by the time the dust settled, Magnolia Events was nothing more than a trademark owned by my ex-husband and his new girlfriend, who conveniently happened to have a background in hospitality management. I'd fought for the house, of course. 28 years of marriage, decades of building equity, memories embedded in every room. But David's lawyer was better than mine, or maybe David's lawyer was just willing to play dirtier than mine. Suddenly there were questions about my mental stability, my ability to maintain the property, my financial responsibility. The cocaine they claimed to find in my car during what I was told was a routine traffic stop certainly didn't help my case, though I still have no idea how it got there. The charges were eventually dropped due to lack of evidence, but the damage to my credibility was done. In the end, I walked away with enough money to cover first and last month's rent on the apartment in Marietta, a 10-year-old Honda Civic with a transmission that shuddered every time I tried to merge onto the highway, and a daughter who seemed to view the entire catastrophic dissolution of our family as a minor inconvenience in her otherwise perfectly curated life. Jessica had taken David's side from the beginning, though she'd never admitted it outright. It was more subtle than that, the way she'd change the subject whenever I tried to explain what had really happened with the business, the way she'd make excuses for why she couldn't visit the apartment, the way she'd developed a sudden interest in having regular dinners with her father and his girlfriend while treating lunch dates with me like diplomatic obligations. "Mom, you have to understand," she'd said during one of our increasingly strained coffee meetings. "Dad seems happy for the first time in years. And Savannah is actually really nice once you get to know her. She's not trying to replace you or anything, but she makes him laugh. When was the last time you saw Dad actually laugh? When was the last time I'd seen myself laugh? I couldn't remember that either." The apartment had become my entire world, a beige purgatory where I spent my days applying for jobs I was overqualified for, and being told I was either too experienced, or too old, or too removed from my field. The catering industry is unforgiving to women who've been out of the game for even a few months, let alone someone with the reputation-destroying baggage I'd accumulated during the divorce. Word travels fast in Atlanta's event planning circles, and apparently the word about me was that I was difficult, unstable, and potentially litigious. I'd started taking shifts at a chain restaurant in Kennesaw, doing prep work and occasional serving when they were short-staffed. The pay was barely enough to cover rent and utilities, but it was something. The manager was a 24-year-old kid named Tyler who called me Miss Margaret. with the kind of patronizing kindness usually reserved for elderly relatives in nursing homes. The other servers were mostly college students or young mothers working second jobs, and I could see the mix of pity and confusion in their eyes when they looked at me. What was a woman my age doing slicing vegetables for $8 an hour? The worst part wasn't the work itself, which was mindless enough to be almost meditative. The worst part was the constant reminder of what I used to be. Every knife cut, every perfectly brunoise onion, every sauce that came together under my hands was evidence of skills that had once commanded premium prices and earned me respect in a competitive industry. Now those same skills were worth $8 an hour, plus the occasional tip when customers felt sorry for the older woman clearly down on her luck. It was during one of these shifts that I'd gotten the idea to invite Jessica to dinner at Seasons 52. I'd just finished a particularly brutal lunch rush, my feet aching in the cheap non-slip shoes that had replaced my collection of professional clogs, when I realized I hadn't seen my daughter in over a month. Our last interaction had been a stilted phone call where she'd told me about a promotion at work while I pretended I wasn't sitting in a laundromat because my apartment's washing machine had been broken for 3 weeks and I couldn't afford to have it fixed. The dinner invitation had felt like reaching across a canyon with a fraying rope, a desperate attempt to bridge the growing distance between us. I'd calculated and recalculated the cost, figuring that if I skipped groceries for a week and walked everywhere instead of driving, I could afford 2 entrees and maybe even a bottle of wine. It would be worth it to see Jessica's face light up, to have a real conversation, to remember what it felt like to be her mother instead of just another obligation in her busy life. Her text response had crushed that hope so thoroughly that I felt something break inside my chest, something that had been cracked for months but was now completely shattered. You know how you look lately. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror again, trying to see what she saw. Yes, I looked tired. Yes, I looked older than my 52 years. Yes, my clothes came from discount stores instead of boutiques, and my shoes were scuffed, and my purse was a canvas tote bag instead of the designer leather handbags I used to carry. But I was still her mother. I was still the woman who had sat up all night when she had pneumonia at age 7, who had driven 6 hours round trip every weekend when she played travel soccer, who had taken out a second mortgage to pay for her college education at Emory. None of that seemed to matter anymore. I was an embarrassment, a reminder of failure and age, and all the ways life could go wrong. I was someone to be hidden away, like a family secret or a shameful addiction. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I picked up my phone and started to type a response. I wanted to tell her how much her words had hurt me, how cruel it was to reduce a person to their appearance, how 26 years of being her mother should have earned me at least the basic respect of not being called ugly to my face. But what came out instead was, "Of course, sweetheart, have fun with your friends. Maybe we can get together another time." Even in my devastation, I was still protecting her feelings, still being the accommodating mother who never wanted to cause conflict or discomfort. The pattern was so ingrained that I couldn't break it, even when breaking it might have been the only way to save whatever was left of our relationship. The afternoon stretched ahead of me like a prison sentence. I had the day off from the restaurant, which meant 14 hours of nothing but my own thoughts and the persistent drip of the kitchen faucet that the landlord kept promising to fix. I tried reading, but the words blurred together. I tried watching television, but every show seemed to feature happy families or successful women or some other reminder of everything I'd lost. Finally, I decided to take a walk. The neighborhood around my apartment complex wasn't particularly scenic, mostly strip malls and chain restaurants interspersed with office buildings and medical centers. But movement was better than sitting still, and the October air had finally cooled enough to make walking pleasant instead of torturous. I found myself walking past a small shopping center I'd driven by dozens of times but never really noticed. There was a nail salon, a dry cleaner, a cell phone repair shop, and tucked into the corner unit, a small storefront with frosted windows and a simple sign that read, "Hartwell Family Law." Something about the understated elegance of the lettering caught my attention, the way it managed to look both professional and approachable. Without really deciding to, I found myself pushing through the glass door into a surprisingly warm and welcoming reception area. The walls were painted a soft sage green, and there were actual plants instead of the plastic alternatives that seemed to populate every other professional office I'd been in lately. Classical music played softly in the background, and the receptionist looked up from her computer with a genuine smile. "Good afternoon," she said. "Do you have an appointment, or were you hoping to speak with someone about our services?" I should have left. I should have mumbled something about being in the wrong place and backed out the door. But something about the woman's kind eyes and the peaceful atmosphere of the office made me feel like I could breathe for the first time in weeks. "I'm not sure," I heard myself saying. "I think I might need some legal advice, but I don't really know where to start." "That's what we're here for," she said warmly. "Let me see if Mr. Hartwell has a few minutes to speak with you. He always likes to do a brief consultation to help people figure out their next steps, even if we're not the right fit for their particular situation." She disappeared through a door marked "Private," and I stood there wondering what had possessed me to walk into a law office when I could barely afford my rent, let alone legal fees. But before I could change my mind and flee, a man emerged from the back office, and I felt something shift in the air around me. He was probably in his early 40s, tall and lean, with prematurely silver hair that somehow made him look distinguished rather than old. His suit was well-tailored but not flashy, and when he smiled, it reached his eyes in a way that suggested he actually enjoyed his work instead of just enduring it. "Mrs.?" he said, extending his hand. "Walsh. Margaret Walsh," I replied, shaking his hand and trying not to notice how warm and strong his grip was. "Daniel Hartwell. Please come back to my office. Can Sandra get you some coffee or tea?" "Coffee would be wonderful, thank you." His office was as welcoming as the reception area, with built-in bookshelves lined with legal volumes and what looked like actual literature, a comfortable seating area with a sofa and 2 armchairs, and a desk that managed to look organized despite being covered with files and papers. He gestured to one of the armchairs and took the other one, creating a sense of conversation rather than interrogation. "So, Margaret, what brings you to see me today?" Something about the way he said my name, with genuine interest and no hint of judgment, made words start tumbling out of me like water through a broken dam. I told him about the divorce, about losing the business, about the apartment and the restaurant job, and the slow dissolution of my relationship with my daughter. I told him about David's manipulation of our business assets, about the mysterious cocaine in my car, about the way my entire life had been systematically dismantled piece by piece. He listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting notes on a legal pad, his expression growing more serious as my story unfolded. When I finally ran out of words, he was quiet for a long moment, studying his notes. "Margaret," he said finally, "I have to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Are you satisfied with how your divorce was handled?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, based on what you've told me, it sounds like your attorney either missed some significant issues or didn't fight as hard as they should have. The business asset manipulation alone suggests grounds for appeal, especially if you can prove your ex-husband deliberately sabotaged the company's value before the divorce proceedings." I stared at him. Is that possible? I mean, the divorce was finalized 8 months ago. I thought that was it. Divorce settlements can be modified under certain circumstances, particularly when there's evidence of fraud or concealment of assets. And some of what you've described sounds like it could qualify. He leaned forward slightly. "Tell me about your original attorney. How did you choose them?" The memory was embarrassing. David recommended him, actually. He said it would be better if we used someone who could handle both sides fairly, someone who wasn't going to try to inflame the situation or drag things out unnecessarily. Daniel's expression darkened. "Your husband recommended your divorce attorney?" "Ex-husband. And yes, I know how that sounds now, but at the time it seemed reasonable. We were trying to keep things amicable, especially for Jessica's sake." "Margaret, I need you to understand something. Having your spouse recommend your divorce attorney is like having your opponent choose your boxing coach. It's a massive conflict of interest, and it explains a lot about why your settlement was so unfavorable." The room seemed to tilt slightly around me. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying it's entirely possible that your attorney was more interested in facilitating a quick, clean divorce than in protecting your interests. And if that's the case, if there was collusion between your ex-husband and your attorney, then yes, there might be grounds to reopen your case." I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing you might actually be able to fly. What would that mean exactly? If we could reopen the case? It would mean examining every aspect of your divorce settlement with fresh eyes. The business valuation, the asset division, the circumstances around the accusations that damaged your credibility. It would mean fighting for what you should have gotten the first time around. I thought about my daughter's text message, about the way she'd dismissed me as an embarrassment, about the $8 an hour job and the beige apartment and the slow erosion of everything I'd once been. How much would something like that cost? I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew the answer. Daniel was quiet for a moment, studying my face. Why don't we worry about that later? Right now, I'm more interested in getting to the truth of what happened to you. Some cases are about money, Margaret. Some cases are about justice. And some cases, he paused, meeting my eyes directly, are about helping someone remember who they really are. For the first time in 8 months, I felt like someone was actually seeing me. Not the failed wife, not the broke divorcee, not the woman too ugly to meet her daughter's friends. Just me, Margaret, the person I'd been before everything fell apart. And maybe, just maybe, the person I could be again. When do we start? I asked. His smile was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. How about right now? The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of document reviews, financial reconstructions, and discoveries that made my stomach churn with a mixture of rage and vindication. Daniel had not been exaggerating when he said my original divorce had been handled improperly. It had been handled criminally. My attorney, Robert Kellerman, had not just failed to protect my interests, he had actively worked against them. Daniel's investigation revealed phone records showing dozens of calls between Kellerman and David's attorney in the weeks leading up to our settlement. More damning still were the emails Daniel's private investigator had uncovered through a former paralegal at Kellerman's firm. Emails that laid out a strategy to minimize my settlement while making it appear that I was getting a fair deal. "Look at this," Daniel said, spreading printouts across his conference table during our 4th meeting. "This is from your attorney to David's attorney, dated 2 weeks before your settlement conference. Quote, client is emotionally fragile and eager to finalize. Suggest emphasizing quick resolution over asset maximization. She'll accept reduced business valuation if framed as avoiding lengthy litigation." Unquote. I stared at the words, feeling sick. He was supposed to be protecting me. He was supposed to be representing you. Instead, he was collaborating with the opposing counsel to manipulate you into accepting less than you deserved. Daniel's voice was controlled, but I could see the anger simmering beneath his professional demeanor. "This isn't just malpractice, Margaret. This is fraud." The business valuation was even worse than I'd suspected. David and his attorney had hired an appraiser who had systematically undervalued every aspect of Magnolia events. From the client contracts to the vendor relationships to the brand recognition I'd spent years building. The appraiser's report, which I'd never been allowed to review in detail during the original proceedings, was riddled with factual errors and questionable methodologies. "He valued your client list at $15,000, Daniel said, shaking his head in disbelief. "Margaret, you had Fortune 500 companies on retainer. Your client list alone should have been worth at least $200,000, probably more." But the real revelation came when Daniel's investigator dug deeper into the timeline of David's affair and its intersection with the dissolution of our business partnership. The woman David had left me for, Savannah Mitchell, hadn't just been his secretary. She'd been an industrial spy, systematically gathering information about our vendors, clients, and operational procedures for over 18 months before the divorce was even filed. "Look at these vendor contracts," Daniel said, spreading another set of documents across the table. "Every single one of your major suppliers received better offers from competing catering companies within 6 months of your divorce. Companies that just happened to offer exactly the same services you specialized in, with pricing structures that undercut yours by precisely 10%. The pattern was unmistakable. David and Savannah had spent nearly 2 years planning not just the end of our marriage, but the complete destruction of everything I'd built professionally. They'd identified my key competitive advantages and systematically transferred them to shell companies they'd established using offshore business registration services. They stole your entire business model," Daniel explained. Your signature menus, your vendor relationships, your pricing strategies, even your marketing materials. Then they used that information to create competing businesses that could undercut you, because they hadn't had to invest in the research and development costs you'd spent years absorbing. I thought about all those sleepless nights I'd spent perfecting recipes, building relationships with vendors, nurturing client connections. Every innovation, every hard-won competitive advantage had been cataloged and copied by the woman sharing my husband's bed, while I worked 16-hour days trying to build something lasting for our family. "Can we prove all this?" I asked. "We can prove enough," Daniel said. "Between the email trail, the vendor contract analysis, and the testimony from some of your former employees who are willing to go on record about what they observed, we have a compelling case for fraudulent concealment of assets and conspiracy to defraud." My former employees. That was another revelation that had emerged from Daniel's investigation. 3 of my most trusted staff members had come forward to describe conversations they'd overheard between David and Savannah. Instances where they'd been asked to provide information about client preferences or vendor pricing that they'd assumed were innocent spousal inquiries about the family business. Maria said she gave Savannah detailed notes about the Pemberton wedding menu development process, Daniel told me. She thought she was just helping David understand why you were working so many late nights. She had no idea Savannah was documenting everything to recreate your signature style for a competing company. Maria Santos had been my sous chef for 5 years, a talented woman who'd helped me develop some of our most popular offerings. During David's systematic dismantling of Magnolia events, she'd been one of the employees poached by a rival company. Now I understood why that company had been so eager to hire her, and why they'd offered her a salary I could never have matched. "They weren't just stealing your business model," Daniel continued. "They were stealing your people, your institutional knowledge, everything that made Magnolia events successful. And they were doing it with information Savannah gathered, while pretending to be nothing more than a supportive secretary interested in her boss's family business." The scope of the betrayal was breathtaking. This wasn't a simple case of a wandering husband leaving his wife for a younger woman. This was a calculated multi-year operation designed to transfer every valuable asset from my name to theirs, while leaving me with nothing but debt and a destroyed reputation. "What's our next step?" I asked. "We file a motion to set aside the divorce decree based on fraud and concealment of assets. We also file civil suits against David, Savannah, and your original attorney for conspiracy, business interference, and professional malpractice. And then," Daniel's smile was sharp and predatory, "we start the discovery process." I'd learned a lot about discovery during my weeks working with Daniel. It was the phase of litigation, where each side had to turn over documents, emails, financial records, anything relevant to the case. For people who'd been conducting their illegal activities through email and digital transactions, discovery was like turning on the lights in a room full of cockroaches. "They're going to fight this," I said. "Of course they are. David has a lot to lose if we expose what he's been doing. His professional reputation, his new business ventures, possibly his freedom if we can prove criminal fraud. But fighting it means depositions, interrogatories, document production. The more they fight, the more evidence we uncover. And if they don't fight, then they offer us a settlement that reflects what you should have gotten in the first place, plus damages for the emotional distress and economic harm they've caused." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Either way, Margaret, you win. The only question is how much you win by." For the first time since the whole nightmare began, I felt like I had agency in my own life again. I wasn't just a victim of circumstances beyond my control. I was a woman with legal representation, with evidence, with a path forward that didn't involve accepting whatever scraps other people decided to throw my way. The change was more than just emotional. As weeks passed and our case gained momentum, I began to feel physically different too. The constant knot of anxiety in my stomach loosened. My appetite returned. I started sleeping through the night instead of lying awake cataloging everything I'd lost. I even bought new clothes, professional outfits suitable for depositions and court appearances, paid for with money Daniel had advanced against our eventual settlement. "Consider it an investment," he'd said when I protested about the advance. You need to look the part of a successful businesswoman, not a victim. Juries and judges make decisions based on first impressions. And I want their first impression of you to be someone who deserves justice, not someone asking for charity. The transformation was remarkable. With properly fitted clothes that flattered my figure instead of hiding it. With regular meals that put some color back in my cheeks. With the confidence that came from having someone in my corner who actually believed in my worth, I began to remember who I'd been before David systematically destroyed my self-esteem along with my business. I kept my job at the restaurant, partly because I couldn't afford to quit until our case was resolved, but mostly because I'd developed an unexpected fondness for the simple honesty of the work. There was something satisfying about the routine, about the way a perfectly diced onion or a properly seasoned sauce existed in the moment without the complex layers of politics and manipulation that had characterized my previous professional life. Tyler, the young manager, started asking my opinion about menu changes and vendor selections. Word had somehow gotten around that I'd once run a successful catering company, and instead of treating me like a charity case, my coworkers began treating me like someone with valuable experience temporarily working below her station. "Miss Margaret," Tyler said one afternoon as I was finishing my prep work, "I've been thinking about what you said about the supplier rotation for our produce. Would you be willing to sit down with me and our food service representative next week? I think we could be getting better quality for the same price if we restructured our ordering." 6 months ago, I would have been flattered by the request, but fundamentally depressed by the context. Now I felt only satisfaction at being able to use my expertise in a way that mattered, regardless of the scale or prestige level. "Of course," I said, "I'd be happy to help." The contrast with my relationship with Jessica couldn't have been more stark. While strangers and casual coworkers were beginning to see value in my knowledge and experience, my own daughter seemed more determined than ever to maintain our emotional distance. She'd called exactly once since the dinner invitation debacle, a stilted conversation where she'd apologized for her poor word choice, while making it clear that she still thought I was overreacting to what she insisted was just an observation about my appearance, not a judgment about my worth as a person. "Mom, you have to admit you've let yourself go a little bit since the divorce," she'd said, her tone suggesting she was being helpful rather than hurtful. "I just thought it might be easier for everyone if you waited until you were feeling more like yourself before meeting my friends. I didn't want you to feel self-conscious. And how exactly would you suggest I go about feeling more like myself?" I'd asked. "I don't know. Maybe see a therapist? Get your hair done? Join a gym?" Dad says Savannah really transformed herself after her divorce, and now she's like a completely different person. "Dad," says Savannah. The casual way she referenced David's girlfriend as a source of wisdom about post-divorce recovery was like a knife between my ribs. The woman who'd systematically destroyed my business was now being held up as an example of successful reinvention. "Jessica, I'm working with a lawyer to review some issues with the divorce settlement," I'd said carefully. "There may have been some irregularities in how the business assets were handled." "Oh, Mom!" Her sigh was heavy with exasperation. "You're not going to turn into one of those bitter ex-wives who can't let go, are you? Dad and Savannah are happy. The divorce is final. You need to move on." "I'm not trying to interfere with their happiness. I'm trying to recover assets that may have been improperly transferred during the divorce process." "What assets?" "Mom, you lost the business because you were too focused on the work to pay attention to the marriage. Dad tried to tell you for years that you were prioritizing the wrong things, but you wouldn't listen. Now you want to blame him for the consequences of your own choices?" The conversation had ended shortly after that, with Jessica claiming she had a work emergency and promising to call back soon. That had been 3 weeks ago. But as painful as my daughter's rejection was, it no longer felt like the defining fact of my existence. I had other things to focus on now, other relationships that were actually nourishing instead of depleting. My growing professional partnership with Daniel was the most obvious example, but there were others too. Mrs. Patterson, my elderly neighbor from the old apartment complex, had started calling regularly to check on my progress and offer encouragement. Some of my former employees had reached out after Daniel's investigator contacted them, expressing shock at what they'd learned about David and Savannah's activities and offering to testify on my behalf. "Margaret, I had no idea. Maria had said when she called. If I'd known what Savannah was really doing with all those questions, I would never have answered them. I thought she was just trying to understand the business so she could be more supportive of Mr. Walsh's role as your partner. You couldn't have known, I had assured her. She was very good at making her interests seem innocent. Is there anything I can do now? Any way to help with your case? Just tell the truth about what you observed and what information you provided. That's all Daniel needs. Done. And Margaret? I always thought you were the heart of Magnolia events. The food was better when you were directly involved in the preparation. The clients were happier when you were managing their events personally. Whatever this new lawyer helps you recover, I hope you consider getting back into the business. Atlanta needs what you do. Conversations like that one were slowly rebuilding something in me that I'd thought was permanently broken. My sense of professional identity and worth. I began to think about what came after our legal case was resolved. What I might want to build with whatever resources and reputation we managed to recover. The most surprising development was my evolving relationship with Daniel himself. What had started as a professional attorney-client relationship had gradually become something deeper and more complex. He was brilliant, certainly, with an intuitive understanding of both legal strategy and human psychology that made him devastatingly effective in depositions and negotiations. But he was also kind in ways I hadn't expected from someone in his position. When I'd mentioned that I was nervous about giving my own deposition, he'd spent an entire Saturday afternoon walking me through practice questions, helping me understand how to answer truthfully while avoiding the rhetorical traps opposing counsel would try to set. Remember, he'd said, your truth is your strength. You were a successful businesswoman who worked hard and trusted the wrong people. You don't need to apologize for that, or minimize your accomplishments. Just tell your story with confidence. When I'd worried about my appearance for the depositions, he'd recommended a personal shopper who specialized in professional wardrobes for women in litigation. Image matters, he'd explained, but not in the way your daughter suggested. You don't need to transform yourself into someone else. You need to present yourself as the competent, accomplished woman you actually are. The personal shopper, a woman named Rachel who worked with executives and attorneys throughout Atlanta, had been a revelation. Instead of trying to hide my age or my body type, she'd helped me find clothes that emphasized my strengths and projected confidence and competence. You have great bone structure and beautiful skin, she'd said during our first appointment. We're not trying to make you look 25. We're trying to make you look like someone who commands respect and gets results. The woman who walked into her first deposition bore little resemblance to the defeated, desperate person who'd stumbled into Daniel's office 6 weeks earlier. My hair was professionally styled in a way that enhanced rather than fought my natural texture. My clothes were perfectly tailored and appropriate for someone who'd once run a successful business and intended to do so again. Most importantly, my posture and demeanor reflected the growing confidence that came from having allies, having a plan, and having evidence. David's deposition was scheduled for a Thursday morning in November. I hadn't seen him since our final divorce court appearance 8 months earlier, and I was curious about how he'd changed during the intervening time. The answer was, not much, except for an air of smugness that hadn't been present during our marriage. He arrived at Daniel's office wearing an expensive suit I didn't recognize, with Savannah at his side, despite the fact that she wasn't involved in this particular proceeding. The message was clear. They were a united front, successful and confident, not intimidated by whatever legal maneuvering his pathetic ex-wife was attempting. "Hello, Margaret," he said when we encountered each other in the hallway outside the conference room. His tone was coolly polite, the way he might address a former business acquaintance he hadn't seen in a while. "David, I have to say, this whole legal action is quite a surprise. I thought we'd settled everything amicably. I hope you're not going to drag this out unnecessarily for everyone involved." Before I could respond, Daniel appeared at my elbow. "Mr. Walsh, I'm Daniel Hartwell, representing your ex-wife. I believe you've met my colleague who'll be conducting your deposition today." The introduction was perfectly professional, but something in Daniel's demeanor made David take a step back. Maybe it was the way Daniel positioned himself slightly between David and me, or the way his handshake lasted just a fraction of a second longer than necessary, but David's confident smirk faltered slightly. "Yes, well, I'm sure we can clear up any misunderstandings quickly," David said, his voice not quite as steady as it had been a moment before. I'm sure we can, Daniel agreed. Truth has a way of clarifying things. The deposition lasted 4 hours. I wasn't allowed in the room, but Daniel had arranged for me to watch via closed-circuit video from his office. What I saw was David's gradual transformation from confident defendant to cornered animal, as the evidence of his fraud was laid out piece by piece. By the time they broke for lunch, David's expensive suit was wrinkled with sweat, and his attorney was making frequent objections that sounded increasingly desperate. By the end of the afternoon, David was taking the Fifth Amendment in response to questions about financial transactions and business communications, essentially admitting that his answers might incriminate him. How did it go? I asked when Daniel returned to his office. Better than I'd hoped, he said, loosening his tie with visible satisfaction. He tried to maintain the innocent husband narrative for about an hour, but the documentation was too comprehensive. When we showed him copies of the emails between Savannah and the competing caterers, when we walked him through the timeline of vendor poaching and client theft, when we presented evidence of the offshore accounts and shell companies, he basically fell apart. What happens now? Now his attorney calls me tomorrow morning and asks what it's going to take to make this go away. Daniel's smile was predatory, and I tell him exactly what it's going to take. What it was going to take, as it turned out, was substantially more than my original divorce settlement would have provided. The business assets alone were worth nearly $2 million at fair market value, not including the additional damages for lost income, emotional distress, and punitive awards related to the fraudulent concealment. They're going to offer us $1.5 million to settle everything, Daniel told me the following week. That's not including the malpractice claim against your original attorney, which should yield another $300,000 to $400,000. I stared at him across his desk, trying to process numbers that seemed too large to be real. $1,500,000? $1,500,000, he corrected gently. Plus whatever we recover from Kellerman and his malpractice insurance. Margaret, this settlement would make you a wealthy woman. Independently wealthy. Independent. The word resonated in ways I hadn't expected. Not just financially independent, though that was certainly part of it, but independent from David's manipulation, from Jessica's conditional approval, from anyone who tried to tell me what I was worth or what I deserved. There's one condition, Daniel continued. They want a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. You couldn't talk publicly about any of this, couldn't write a book, couldn't give interviews about what happened. They want to buy my silence. They want to buy your silence and avoid criminal charges. Because make no mistake, Margaret, what David and Savannah did crosses the line from unethical into illegal. The fraud alone could result in federal charges if the right prosecutor decides to pursue it. I thought about that for a long moment. There was appeal in the idea of seeing David and Savannah face criminal consequences for what they'd done. But there was even more appeal in the idea of taking their money and using it to build something they could never touch or control. I want to accept the settlement, I said finally. Are you sure? We could push for more or pursue the criminal angle. I'm sure. I don't want to spend the next 2 years of my life in litigation. I want to take their money and use it to build something better than what they destroyed. Daniel nodded. I think that's wise. Sometimes the best revenge is living well. I don't want revenge anymore, I said, and realized as I spoke that it was true. I want justice. And justice, in this case, looks like me walking away with enough resources to never be vulnerable to people like them again. The settlement was finalized 3 weeks later. By Christmas, I had more money in my bank account than I'd ever imagined possible. More than David and I had accumulated in 28 years of marriage. More importantly, I had something else I'd never expected to find. A clear vision of what came next. I was going to rebuild Magnolia Events, but better this time. Bigger, more sophisticated, more resilient. And I was going to do it in a way that made it impossible for anyone to take it away from me again. The only question was whether Jessica would be part of that future, or whether she'd continue to align herself with the people who'd tried to destroy her mother's life. Somehow, sitting in my new downtown loft apartment on Christmas morning, opening a bottle of champagne I'd bought with money I'd earned through my own strength and determination, I found I didn't really care what she decided. For the first time in my adult life, I was enough all by myself. 6 months later, I stood in the gleaming kitchen of Magnolia Catering's new flagship location, watching my team of 15 professional chefs and event coordinators prepare for what would be the most high-profile event in the company's history. The governor's annual economic summit was being held at the Ritz-Carlton downtown, and we'd been selected to cater the entire 3-day conference for 800 guests. The irony wasn't lost on me that the keynote speaker for the opening night gala was David's former business partner, the man who'd helped him orchestrate the destruction of my original company. Marcus Pemberton would be dining on my signature herb-crusted salmon while completely unaware that the woman he'd helped to destroy was now the most sought-after caterer in the Southeast. The new Magnolia Catering bore little resemblance to the modest operation I'd built during my marriage. This was a full-scale culinary empire spanning 3 states. With a team of James Beard-trained chefs, a fleet of custom-designed catering vehicles, and a client list that read like a who's who of Fortune 500 companies and A-list celebrities. We'd catered events for the Atlanta Hawks, handled the launch party for Tyler Perry's latest production company, and were booked solid for the next 18 months. More importantly, this version of my company was built to be bulletproof. Every contract was ironclad. Every employee was bound by comprehensive confidentiality agreements, and every aspect of our operation was protected by legal structures that would make it impossible for anyone to strip away what I'd built. Daniel had helped me create corporate entities within entities, intellectual property protections, and financial arrangements that would survive any future romantic catastrophes I might be foolish enough to encounter. Not that romance was particularly high on my priority list these days, though Daniel had made it clear that his interest in me extended beyond our professional relationship. The settlement of my case had formally ended our attorney-client relationship, which had opened the door for conversations that would have been inappropriate when he was representing me. "You know," he'd said over dinner at Canoe the previous week, "I've been thinking about what you said about never wanting to be vulnerable to people like David again. What about it? I think you're misunderstanding what made you vulnerable. It wasn't trusting someone or building something together. It was trusting the wrong someone and not protecting yourself legally from the beginning." He'd reached across the table and touched my hand gently. "Not everyone is David, Margaret. Some people actually mean what they say when they promise to support you." The gesture had sent an unexpected jolt through me, a reminder that I was still a woman with needs and desires that had nothing to do with business success or financial security. But I wasn't ready for that conversation yet, wasn't sure I'd ever be ready for it. The scars from David's betrayal went deeper than financial fraud. They'd taught me that the people who claimed to love you could also be the ones most willing to destroy you when it served their purposes. For now, I was content to focus on work, on building something that couldn't be taken away by divorce lawyers or manipulative partners. The satisfaction I felt watching my team execute a flawless service was pure and uncomplicated, in ways that personal relationships had never been for me. "Chef Margaret," my sous chef called from across the kitchen, "the bread service is ready for final approval." I walked over to inspect the array of artisanal breads and spreads we'd prepared for the cocktail reception. Everything was perfect, from the rosemary focaccia with aged balsamic to the house-made hummus that had become one of our signature offerings. This was what I'd always been good at, creating experiences that made people feel valued and cared for, even if it was only for the duration of a meal. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I glanced down to see Jessica's name on the screen. We'd spoken exactly twice since my settlement, both stilted conversations where she'd offered vague congratulations on my business success, while making it clear that she still thought my legal action against her father had been vindictive and unnecessary. The message was longer than her usual communications. "Mom, I need to talk to you. Something's happened. Can you call me when you get this? It's urgent." I stared at the message for a long moment, feeling a familiar knot of anxiety form in my stomach. Jessica only contacted me when she wanted something, or when there was some kind of crisis that required maternal intervention. Given that we hadn't spoken in 3 months, this was probably the latter. But tonight was the governor's summit. Tonight was the culmination of months of planning and preparation. The event that would cement Magnolia Catering's reputation as the premier culinary service in the region. Whatever crisis Jessica was facing would have to wait until tomorrow. I turned off my phone and slipped it into my jacket pocket. "Let's load the transport vehicles," I announced to my team. "We have a reputation to build." The event was flawless from start to finish. The cocktail reception featured past hors d'oeuvre that had guests literally applauding when my servers presented the final course. The dinner service was executed with military precision, every plate perfectly plated and served at the optimal temperature. The late-night dessert buffet featured a chocolate sculpture centerpiece that had people taking photographs and posting them on social media before they'd even tasted the accompanying sweet treats. I moved through the evening like a conductor orchestrating a symphony, checking in with different stations, troubleshooting minor issues before they became major problems, and accepting the compliments of guests and hotel staff with the confidence of someone who knew she'd delivered exactly what she'd promised. Mrs. Walsh, the governor's chief of staff, approached me during the dessert service. "I wanted to thank you personally for what your team accomplished tonight. This was extraordinary." "I'm so glad you're pleased," I replied. "Creating memorable experiences is what we do." "Well, you've certainly created one tonight. We'll definitely be recommending Magnolia Catering to our colleagues in other states. I suspect you're going to be very busy in the coming months." Indeed, by the time we finished breaking down the service at 2 in the morning, I'd collected business cards from event planners in Nashville, Charlotte, and Jacksonville, all expressing interest in bringing Magnolia Catering to their cities for major events. The expansion I'd been considering was no longer a distant possibility. It was an immediate opportunity. I finally turned my phone back on as my team was loading the last of the equipment into our transport vehicles. There were 7 missed calls from Jessica, each one logged at increasingly late hours. The most recent had come in at 1:30 in the morning, which meant whatever crisis she was dealing with was significant enough to keep her awake well past her usual bedtime. I called her back from the passenger seat of our lead vehicle as my driver navigated the empty downtown streets back to our facility. "Mom, thank God," she answered on the first ring. "I've been trying to reach you all night." "I was working. What's wrong?" "It's Dad. And Savannah." "Mom, I think I made a terrible mistake." The knot in my stomach tightened. What kind of mistake? "I loaned them money. A lot of money. And now they're saying they can't pay it back, and there are lawyers involved, and I think they might have been lying to me about everything." I closed my eyes and leaned back against the headrest. Of course, David and Savannah had found a way to involve Jessica in whatever financial schemes they were running. And of course, Jessica was only calling me now that she needed help dealing with the consequences. "How much money, Jessica?" $80,000. It was supposed to be a short-term loan to help them expand Savannah's consulting business. They said they'd pay it back with interest in 6 months, and the business plan looked really solid. $80,000. More than I'd made in a year at my previous peak income, more than many families earned annually. Jessica had that kind of money to loan because she'd inherited a trust fund from David's mother, money that was supposed to be her safety net for major life purchases, like a house or graduate school. "When did you loan them this money?" 4 months ago. They were supposed to start making payments last month, but first they said there was a delay with a major client. Then they said there were some unexpected expenses, and now Savannah is saying the whole business might be failing, and they might have to declare bankruptcy. "Do you have a written agreement?" "Yes, but Dad said it was just a formality, that we didn't really need it because we're family. The terms are pretty vague, and I don't think it's enforceable if they declare bankruptcy." Family. The word that David always used to manipulate people into lowering their guard, into trusting him with things they should have protected. The same word he'd used to convince me to let him become my business partner, to share financial information with his secretary, to accept his recommendation for a divorce attorney. "Jessica, have you talked to a lawyer about this?" "I called a few, but they all want retainers I can't afford, and they're talking about the case like it's going to take months or years to resolve." "Mom, I can't afford to be in litigation for years. I need that money." "What do you need it for?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I'm getting divorced." The words hit me like a physical blow. Jessica was getting divorced, and instead of calling her mother for emotional support, she'd been trying to handle everything on her own while also dealing with her father's latest financial manipulations. "Jessica, why didn't you tell me?" "Because I knew you'd say I told you so. Because I knew you'd point out that you warned me about trusting Dad and Savannah. Because I've been such a horrible daughter to you, and I didn't think I deserved your help." The honesty in her voice was devastating. For the first time since our relationship had deteriorated, Jessica sounded like the little girl who used to crawl into my bed after nightmares, who used to ask me to fix everything that went wrong in her small world. "Where are you right now?" I asked. "I'm at my apartment, but not for much longer. Kevin and I have to sell it as part of the divorce settlement. And I need money for a deposit on a new place. That's why I need the loan back from Dad and Savannah. I literally don't have anywhere else to turn." Kevin. I'd met Jessica's husband exactly 3 times during their 4-year marriage. Brief encounters at holiday gatherings where he'd been polite but distant. Clearly more interested in David's sports commentary than in getting to know his wife's mother. I'd suspected the marriage was in trouble for months based on the way Jessica avoided mentioning him in our rare conversations, but I'd assumed she'd talk to me if she wanted my support. "What happened with Kevin?" "He's been having an affair with his personal trainer for over a year. I found out 3 months ago, and we've been trying to work it out, but last week I discovered he'd emptied our savings account to pay for a vacation to Cabo with her. The same week I found out Dad and Savannah couldn't make their loan payment. 3 months ago." Jessica had discovered her husband's affair around the same time I'd been celebrating the settlement of my own case against her father's financial manipulations. While I'd been rebuilding my business and my life, my daughter had been dealing with her own marital crisis and financial betrayal, all alone. "Jessica, I'm coming over." "Mom, it's almost 3 in the morning. I don't care. We need to talk and you shouldn't be dealing with this by yourself." "You don't have to. I know you're probably angry with me for how I've treated you, and I know you have your own life now." "Jessica Marie Walsh," I said, using the tone I'd employed when she was 12, and trying to convince me she didn't need my help with something that was clearly beyond her abilities. "I am your mother. That doesn't change because we've had disagreements or because you've made poor choices. I'm coming over, and we're going to figure this out together." The drive to Jessica's apartment in Virginia Highland took 20 minutes at that hour, through empty streets that gave me time to process what I'd learned and prepare for what was likely to be a difficult conversation. My daughter was facing the same kind of systematic financial betrayal I'd experienced, but with the added complication that the people stealing from her were the same people who'd stolen from me. David and Savannah hadn't just destroyed my business and my marriage. They'd apparently moved on to targeting our daughter, using her trust and her financial resources to fund whatever schemes they were running now. The pattern was becoming clear. They identified people who loved them or trusted them, figured out what those people had that was valuable, and then systematically transferred those assets to themselves while maintaining the pretense of family relationships or business partnerships. Jessica's apartment building was a converted warehouse in one of Atlanta's trendy neighborhoods, the kind of place that appealed to young professionals who wanted to live somewhere with character and walkability. The lobby was dimly lit at this hour, but Jessica was waiting for me at the elevator, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd seen her since childhood. She was wearing an oversized sweatshirt and yoga pants, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her face bare of the carefully applied makeup she usually wore. Without the professional polish, she looked impossibly young and vulnerable, like the little girl who used to run to me when the world seemed too big and scary to navigate alone. "Mom," she said, and her voice broke on the word. I wrapped my arms around her without hesitation, feeling her collapse against me with a desperation that reminded me how much I'd missed being needed by my daughter. For 18 months, she'd held me at arm's length, treating me like an embarrassment and a burden. Now, suddenly, I was her mother again, the person she turned to when everything else fell apart. "It's going to be okay," I murmured into her hair. "We're gonna fix this." Her apartment was in chaos, boxes scattered throughout the living room, personal belongings sorted into piles that suggested she was in the early stages of packing for a move she couldn't afford. Financial documents were spread across her dining room table like evidence in a criminal investigation, which, I was beginning to suspect, they might actually be. "Show me everything," I said, settling into one of her dining room chairs. "The loan agreement, the business plan they showed you, all the communications you've had with them about repayment." For the next 2 hours, we went through every piece of documentation related to Jessica's financial entanglement with David and Savannah. What emerged was a pattern of deception that was depressingly familiar, though more sophisticated than the schemes they'd used against me. The business plan for Savannah's consulting company was professional and detailed, complete with market research, financial projections, and client testimonials that looked completely legitimate. But When I started checking the references and researching the supposed client companies, cracks appeared in the facade. Jessica, this client company, Meridian Strategic Solutions, doesn't exist. I can't find any record of it anywhere, not even a basic business registration. That's impossible. Savannah showed me their offices when she was explaining the scope of the consulting contract. Did you actually go inside the offices? Or did she just drive you past a building? Jessica's face fell as she realized the implication. She drove me past a building. Said she couldn't take me inside because of confidentiality agreements with her clients. I continued digging through the documentation, cross-referencing business names, and contact information with online databases and business directories. By dawn, it was clear that at least 60% of Savannah's supposed client base was completely fictional, elaborate constructions designed to make her consulting business appear more successful and stable than it actually was. Mom, what does this mean? It means your father and Savannah committed fraud to obtain your loan. They used falsified business documents and fake client testimonials to convince you to invest in a company that essentially doesn't exist. Can we get the money back? I thought about that question carefully. Based on my own experience with David and Savannah's schemes, the money was probably already spent or hidden in accounts designed to be difficult to trace. But that didn't mean Jessica was without recourse. We're going to try. But first, I want you to understand something important. You're not the first person they've done this to, and you probably won't be the last. This is what they do. They identify people who trust them, figure out what those people have that's valuable, and then they systematically transfer those assets to themselves. Why would Dad do this to me? I'm his daughter. The pain in her voice was heartbreaking. Despite everything Jessica had witnessed during David's divorce manipulation and business destruction, she'd still believed that her relationship with him was different, that his love for her would protect her from the worst of his behaviors. Because to people like your father, relationships are transactions. You have value to him as long as you're useful, as long as you have something he wants or needs. When you stop being useful, or when taking from you serves his purposes better than protecting you, the relationship becomes expendable. Jessica was crying now, the kind of deep, soul-wrenching sobs that come when fundamental assumptions about the world are suddenly revealed to be false. I moved my chair closer to hers and rubbed her back while she processed the reality of who her father actually was. "I'm so sorry, Mom," she said when she could finally speak again. "I'm sorry for how I treated you during the divorce. I'm sorry for taking their side. I'm sorry for saying you were too ugly to meet my friends. I was so stupid." "You weren't stupid, sweetheart. You were manipulated by people who are very good at manipulation. The same people who fooled me for 28 years. But you tried to warn me and I wouldn't listen. I thought you were just being bitter and vindictive. I was bitter. And I probably was vindictive. But I was also right about your father and Savannah, and I should have found a way to make you understand that without alienating you." We sat in silence for a few minutes, processing the weight of everything that had been damaged and everything that needed to be repaired. Then Jessica looked up at me with an expression I recognized from her childhood, the determined look she got when she decided to tackle a problem head-on. "What do we do now?" "Now we call Daniel Hartwell and we explain what's happened. And then we destroy them." The legal process moved quickly once Daniel understood the scope of David and Savannah's latest scheme. The fake business documentation Jessica had been shown constituted clear evidence of wire fraud, especially since the loan had been transferred electronically based on false representations. The pattern of deception, combined with their previous fraud against me, suggested a criminal enterprise that had been operating for years. "This isn't just civil fraud anymore," Daniel explained during our first strategy meeting with Jessica. "This is federal wire fraud conspiracy and potentially racketeering if we can prove they've been running this kind of scheme against multiple victims." "Are there other victims?" Jessica asked. "We think so. My investigator has identified at least 3 other women who've had suspicious financial dealings with David or Savannah in the past 2 years. Ex-girlfriends, business associates, even Savannah's own sister. The amounts are smaller than what they took from you, but the pattern is consistent. The investigation revealed a level of systematic financial predation that was breathtaking in its scope and audacity. David and Savannah hadn't just been running isolated scams. They'd been operating what amounted to a family fraud enterprise, targeting anyone in their personal or professional network who had assets worth stealing. Savannah's sister had lost $15,000 to a fake investment opportunity. An ex-girlfriend of David's had been convinced to co-sign a business loan that she was now solely responsible for paying. A former client of Savannah's consulting business had paid for services that were never delivered, with the money disappearing into personal accounts that David and Savannah used for vacations and luxury purchases. The beautiful thing about this case, Daniel told us, is that they've been so successful for so long that they've gotten sloppy. They're using the same fake business entities across multiple schemes, recycling the same false testimonials, even using identical language in different fraud documents. It's like they copied and pasted their way into federal charges. The federal prosecutor who reviewed our evidence was particularly interested in the interstate nature of their activities. David and Savannah had been operating fake businesses in Georgia, Florida, and North Carolina, using mail and wire communications to facilitate their schemes across state lines. That made it a federal case, with federal resources and federal penalties. They're looking at 10 to 15 years if convicted, Daniel told us after his meeting with the prosecutor's office. Wire fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, racketeering. And that's just the federal charges. Individual states may want to pursue their own cases for specific victims. But the criminal case was only part of our strategy. We were also pursuing civil action to recover Jessica's money and additional damages for the emotional distress and financial harm they'd caused. More importantly, we were working to freeze their assets before they could be hidden or transferred offshore. The key is moving fast, Daniel explained. People like David and Savannah always have exit strategies. They'll try to liquidate everything and disappear if they think they're about to be caught. We needn't have worried. David and Savannah's arrogance had made them complacent about covering their tracks. When federal agents executed search warrants on their homes and offices, they found evidence of financial crimes dating back nearly 5 years, including detailed records of every scheme they'd operated and every victim they'd targeted. The local news picked up the story within days of their arrest, and suddenly I found myself fielding calls from reporters who wanted to know about my own experience with the Atlanta financial fraud ring, as Channel 2 Action News had dubbed them. I declined most of the interview requests, but I did agree to speak with a reporter from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, who was writing a comprehensive piece about financial fraud targeting family members and close friends. Mrs. Walsh, based on your experience, what advice would you give to other people who might be targeted by this kind of scheme? Trust your instincts, I said. If something feels wrong, it probably is wrong. And don't let anyone, even family members, pressure you into making financial decisions quickly or without proper documentation. What about people who are already victims of this kind of fraud? Get help. Find a lawyer who specializes in fraud cases. Document everything, and don't be embarrassed about being victimized. People like David Walsh and Savannah Mitchell are professionals at manipulation. They've spent years perfecting their techniques. Being fooled by them doesn't make you stupid or naive. It makes you human. The article ran on the front page of the Sunday Business section, with photographs of David and Savannah being led away in handcuffs, and a sidebar about the warning signs of financial fraud. I kept a copy of the newspaper, not out of vindictiveness, but as a reminder of how far I'd traveled from the broken, desperate woman who'd stumbled into Daniel's office 18 months earlier. Jessica moved into a guest bedroom in my new penthouse apartment while her divorce was finalized and the criminal case against her father proceeded through the courts. Having her there was awkward at first, both of us navigating the emotional debris of our damaged relationship while trying to rebuild something functional and healthy. But gradually we found our rhythm. Jessica helped with administrative tasks for Magnolia Catering, bringing her nonprofit management skills to bear on operational challenges I'd been struggling with as the business expanded. I provided emotional support and practical guidance as she worked through the trauma of discovering that both her father and her husband had betrayed her trust in fundamental ways. I keep wondering what's wrong with me, she said one evening as we were reviewing catering contracts in my home office. How did I end up trusting two different men who turned out to be liars and thieves? There's nothing wrong with you, I replied. You were raised to believe that people who claim to love you actually have your best interests at heart. That's not a character flaw, Jessica. That's how normal people approach relationships. But you figured out Dad was lying. Eventually. After 28 years of marriage and losing everything I'd built. And I only figured it out because he got sloppy and left evidence where I could find it. Do you think I'll ever be able to trust anyone again? I thought about that question, about Daniel's dinner invitations and my own carefully guarded heart, about the balance between protective skepticism and the human need for connection. I think you'll learn to trust more carefully, I said finally. You'll ask for documentation where you used to take people at their word. You'll verify stories instead of just believing them. You'll protect your assets instead of assuming other people will protect them for you. But yes, I think you'll trust again. Just more wisely. The trial lasted 3 weeks and resulted in convictions on all counts for both David and Savannah. David was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution of over $2 million to his various victims. Savannah received 8 years and was ordered to pay an additional $800,000 in damages. Jessica testified during the sentencing phase, describing the impact of her father's betrayal on her ability to trust others and her financial security. Her victim impact statement was devastating in its quiet dignity, and I watched from the gallery as several jurors wiped away tears during her testimony. Your Honor, she concluded, my father didn't just steal my money. He stole my ability to believe that the people who claim to love me actually want what's best for me. He stole my faith in family relationships and my confidence in my own judgment. Those are losses that can't be measured in dollars, and they can't be repaid with restitution. David showed no emotion during her testimony, staring straight ahead like he was listening to a weather report, rather than his daughter's description of how his actions had devastated her life. Savannah, on the other hand, was crying openly, though whether from genuine remorse or self-pity was impossible to determine. The judge's sentencing remarks were scathing. Mr. Walsh and Ms. Mitchell, you have demonstrated a level of callous disregard for the welfare of others that is truly shocking. You targeted people who trusted you, people who loved you, people who should have been able to count on your support and protection. Instead, you systematically betrayed that trust for your own financial gain. The sentences I'm imposing today reflect not just the financial harm you've caused, but the emotional and psychological damage you've inflicted on people who had every reason to believe you cared about their welfare. After the sentencing, Jessica and I walked out of the federal courthouse together into the bright Atlanta sunshine. For the first time in 2 years, I felt like the nightmare was truly over, not just for me, but for all of David and Savannah's victims. How do you feel? I asked Jessica as we waited for our car. Empty, she said after a moment. I thought I'd feel satisfied or vindicated or something, but mostly I just feel empty. That's normal. Closure doesn't always feel the way we expect it to. Do you feel closure? I considered the question as our driver pulled up to the curb. Did I feel closure? I felt satisfied that justice had been served, certainly. I felt vindicated in my decision to fight back instead of accepting the scraps David and his lawyer had tried to force on me. But mostly, I felt grateful. Grateful for Daniel's expertise and integrity. Grateful for Jessica's courage in testifying. Grateful for the legal system that had ultimately protected us when we couldn't protect ourselves. I feel free, I said finally. For the first time in years, I feel completely free. That freedom manifested itself in ways both large and small over the following months. Magnolia Catering expanded into 3 new markets, with flagship locations in Nashville, Charlotte, and Jacksonville. We hired 42 new employees and were featured on the Food Network as one of the Southeast's premier catering companies. I was invited to speak at business conferences about entrepreneurship and recovery from financial fraud. But the most meaningful changes were personal. Jessica and I rebuilt our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect and honest communication, instead of obligation and guilt. She took a job as operations manager for Magnolia Catering, bringing her organizational skills and fresh perspective to a business that had grown almost too quickly for me to manage alone. Daniel and I finally had the conversation about whether our relationship could become something more than professional collaboration and friendship. It took place over dinner at a small French restaurant in Buckhead, 6 months after David's sentencing and nearly 2 years after our first meeting in his law office. "I've been thinking about what you said about never wanting to be vulnerable again," he said over dessert. "And I've realized that I don't want you to be vulnerable to me in the same way you were vulnerable to David. I don't want you to need me for financial security, or emotional validation, or any of the things that made you dependent on him." "What do you want?" I asked. "I want you to choose me, because you want to share your life with someone who appreciates who you are and what you've accomplished. I want you to trust me because I've earned that trust through my actions, not because you need to trust me in order to survive. And what if I'm never able to trust anyone that completely again? Then we'll build something different. Something based on mutual respect, and shared goals, and genuine affection, without the kind of total emotional and financial dependence that made you so vulnerable before." It was the most honest conversation about love and trust I'd ever had with anyone, and it resulted in the most honest relationship I'd ever been part of. Daniel and I began dating, but I kept my own apartment, my own bank accounts, my own business interests. We shared our lives without merging them, supported each other without becoming dependent on each other. A year later, when he asked me to marry him, I said yes, with the understanding that our marriage would be a partnership between equals, protected by prenuptial agreements and legal structures that would preserve our individual autonomy even as we built something together. The wedding was small and elegant, held in the garden of my penthouse apartment with catering provided by my own company. Jessica served as my maid of honor, and Daniel's teenage daughter from his first marriage was our flower girl. It was a celebration of love, certainly, but it was also a celebration of survival, of rebuilding, of refusing to let other people's betrayals define our capacity for happiness. During the reception, as I was accepting congratulations from guests and watching my team execute a flawless dinner service, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. For a moment, I considered ignoring it entirely. But something made me glance at the screen. The message was from David, somehow sent from federal prison through methods I didn't want to understand. "Congratulations on your wedding. I saw the announcement in the society pages. You look beautiful. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me someday." I stared at the message for a long moment, feeling absolutely nothing. No anger, no pain, no lingering resentment. Just complete indifference to the man who had once been the center of my universe, and who had tried to destroy everything I cared about. I showed the message to Jessica, who was standing nearby with a glass of champagne and a smile I hadn't seen since she was a teenager. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Nothing," I said, deleting the message without responding. "He doesn't exist to me anymore." And that, I realized, was true. David Walsh, the man who had manipulated and betrayed me, who had stolen from his own daughter, who had tried to reduce me to nothing more than a grateful recipient of scraps, had no power over my life anymore. He was just a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened to people who mistook manipulation for strength and cruelty for intelligence. The woman I'd become, the woman who had built an empire from nothing, who had fought back against injustice and won, who had raised a daughter strong enough to survive her own betrayals and rebuild her own life, was completely beyond his reach. I slipped my phone back into my purse and rejoined my own celebration, surrounded by people who valued me for who I actually was, rather than what they could take from me. For the first time in my adult life, I was exactly where I belonged, with exactly the people who deserved to be there. The little girl who had once been ashamed to be seen with me was now my business partner and my closest ally. The career I'd thought was destroyed forever was more successful than I'd ever dared to dream. The man I'd married was someone who celebrated my strength instead of trying to diminish it. I was no longer the woman who had been too ugly to meet her daughter's friends. I was the woman who had met her daughter's father in federal court and watched him led away in handcuffs for his crimes. It had been quite a transformation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.